Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
What is the worst church poster that you've ever seen?
Do you want my list? Actually, you know this because I do send you them. I have a growing list of bad posters that I see from churches, and I share them to you. And
they're terrible.
We have they are terrible, and we have a constructive analysis session on them. And
that's a very nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard because you want to be encouraging that people are doing things and putting things out there, but some are really awful.
Yeah, and I must admit, to some extent, I've become a bit immune to it, I think, because actually, if we go all the way back to sort of like 15 years ago, terrible church posters and those like horrific, the alphabet letters up on a notice board with a cheesy sign that no one's actually going to, take in the right way. Those were the reasons I got into design for churches in the first place, because I'm just like, I love you, but you're doing a terrible job.
Let me come and improve you.
Yeah, so, I mean, you'll often see posters that have got a million different fonts on them that just look a mess. I mean, some of the one that you sent me the other week had fonts that were changing halfway through a sentence, or you'd have the odd letter that was in a different font or a different size. It's a small thing, but underlining words randomly, it looks poor, and it's like, you're not in Microsoft Word, come on.
Yeah, or the weird little images that have like nothing to do with what it is. Yeah. Or the one that kind of almost annoys me more is where it's like, we're having a coffee morning, here are 50 different pictures and emojis of coffee.
In case you don't know what coffee is.
I know what a coffee morning is, just put one nice picture of a coffee cup on there, kind of thing. But yeah, either not enough, not the right images, or too many of too obvious images.
I mean, you sent me one recently for an event that for some reason had a picture of a sonogram, like a scan on there. And I mean, I'm conscious, like when we announced on social media that we were pregnant, I didn't want to put a picture like that up, because for people where it's like a sensitive issue, that's so triggering. Yeah. And yet this was on a church poster that it took me like 5 minutes to work out what it had to do with the event at all.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. I'm still confused. Yeah.
Or like the ones where you've got the spell checker visible because they've just taken a screenshot.
Which again, that annoys me because, okay, maybe there is a spelling mistake, but no one else needs to know. But equally, again, I've got this one up. It says Purbeck or say Swanage. That's my hometown. Of course, it's not going to be in word spell checker because that's not a word to them. Whereas I know it's a word, and I look at this and go, wait, hang on, have you spelt that wrong? Like, I just don't get why you'd think that would be okay to then publish.
I mean, either add it to dictionary, or even if you don't do that, maybe just go file save as rather than just taking a screenshot of your Word document. And I guess, although it doesn't necessarily look as terrible, the worst offender is just when there's missing details from the event. So you don't know what church is putting the event on, or you don't know when it is or what to do. Yeah, so there is some terrible church design out there. We've started off in a very negative note there. We don't want to be critical because we know it's hard. There's limited time, limited budgets, limited creative skills, even if you do have volunteers, in addition to, just doing it yourself. But when we see these kind of posters, when people who are out there not to do with the church see these kind of posters, it leaves a poor taste in the mouth. If we look at it on a purely human level, I don't think it's very likely that someone's going to look at a terrible poster like this and go, yep, sign me up. I want to be at that event. That looks quality. It's just not going to happen. So for this episode, we want to hopefully flip around and be a bit more positive, but give some really practical tips that are simple, but really important for designing your church publicity. And we're probably going to refer more to posters, but essentially you can swap out that word for flyers or postcards, because generally they serve a very similar purpose. It's just that they're more of a handout format rather than hung on the wall. And obviously we're talking print primarily, but a lot of these tips are quite general graphic design tips, so you can apply them to digital design as well, such as if you're creating graphics for your social media or for YouTube or even for your website.
So our first tip, and I say this as the non-graphic designer of the two of us, is that it's okay to start with templates. Now, this may not always be the right option, but it's certainly not something that you need to feel bad about or shy away from. We've talked about tools like Canva before, which have a load of professionally designed templates that you can adapt to your own images, text, and colours. And I love doing that. And I think it's a really great way of sort of developing my creative ideas, even if I end up changing the initial template that I was using.
Yeah.
But you can also use sites like Creative Market to purchase templates that fit the look and feel that you're going for. Or another thing that I love doing is going on Pinterest just to find interesting and different examples, just to sort of guide me as I'm thinking about what I might want to design.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these templates can be a great way of saving time whilst achieving a more polished aesthetic than you might be able to achieve starting from scratch on a plain white screen. However, with that said, using a template is certainly not an excuse to say, yeah, done, and skip the rest of this podcast. Perish the thought. Though the rest of the tips we have for you will still apply, and I'm sure you've all seen examples of designs that start off as a lovely looking template, but then have sort of been butchered into something that is less lovely.
Yeah, definitely. So the next practical tip then is to use a couple of complementary fonts. We've alluded to it already in the intro, but some of the worst posters are those that just have too many typefaces in use. Mm-hmm. Unless you're going for a very particular look where you're mashing lots of different styles together as a contrast, something which is easier said than done, you probably want an absolute maximum of 3 different fonts in your design. So what do we mean by complementary fonts? Well, as much as we like to have fonts that told us we look nice, obviously we mean fonts that complement each other. Some fonts work better together than others, either through their similarities or through complete contrast. So serif fonts tend to offer a more formal or traditional feel. So think of your Times New Roman, where you've got the little flicks on the edges of the letters. And then sans serifs, without those flicks, are generally used more on screens as they're easier to read on screens, and as bold headlines, and they lend a more modern look to the design. But often they compare really well together. It can take a bit of trial and error to learn what works and what doesn't, and that goes for your own personal style, the church's style, as much as just the fonts themselves. But as ever, there are plenty of resources to help you. So if you just search for font pairings, that will bring up loads of helpful results. Many of them are free to download and use as well, when you've got libraries such as Google Fonts with hundreds of free fonts there.
Canva also do have some font pairing resources, which is great if you're using Canva anyway, so you know that those font pairings or that all of the fonts that are in the pairings will be within the platform itself.
Yeah, that's really useful. And what it will avoid is just using whatever the default font is when you open up Microsoft Word.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, the exact same rule is true with colours. Yeah. As we've mentioned before, there are tools like Coolers that can help you to create a nice complementary colour scheme. But as with your fonts, don't overdo it. So choose a couple of fonts, a small handful of colours, ideally having referred to your brand guidelines to keep with your consistent church style. And then rather than adding more fonts, use different weights like regular or bold and different font sizes to draw attention to the different info in your design without cluttering it up with a clumsy font spree. So on the subject of clutter,
let your designs breathe. It feels very zen to sort of say that. Yeah, let's all do some chanting before we do some designing. It can be very tempting to cram as much information as possible onto a poster so that you're answering every possible question or just giving them loads of information. But actually, that's not really what you want to be doing. Stop, breathe. Let your designs breathe too. Space is so important in design.
Yeah.
It avoids clutter, but more importantly, draws the eye to the information that you want to prioritize. Of course, for this to work, you'll need to have carefully considered actually what information that you want to include.
Yeah, so the next tip is include key information, which sounds really obvious, but as we said before, missing information is just going to destroy the purpose of your poster and why it exists. So think about what each reader of your poster needs to know to make a decision about the thing that you're promoting. And don't overthink it either. The title of the event is a given that has to be included, as are the time, the date, and the location. And if it's not obvious from the title and the imagery that you've used, you might want a tagline or a short paragraph about what to expect. But don't overdo it, because the other critical element is a website link. And ideally that will be to a specific page on your website that has further details. Feel free to put some FAQs on this page. This is the place for the further information, as well as a way to sign up or get in touch if people need to find out more. And incidentally, if a sign up or a ticket purchase is something that's required to attend the event that you're promoting, make sure to note that on the poster so people know what to do. This is also the stuff that you can use to promote your event on social media. Offer those FAQs as ways to engage with people in a friendly format.
Yeah.
I like to think of church print publicity a little bit like a save the date for a wedding, where the wedding guests will get a teaser with just enough information to whet their appetite, but also know to expect or look for further details. So by thinking in this way, you've made your job a lot easier, in as much as it's very difficult to make a poster look cluttered when you're only including these key bits of information. And when there's a clear action that you want people to take, they're going to be a lot more likely to actually do it. Before we move on, it's worth pointing out you should include your church name or logo. It doesn't have to be huge, but probably it should be there. It's a little bit less important for posters, as generally they're going to be placed in or around your church building. But for handouts, it's critical. And again, on social media, it's helpful to have a logo there, but it doesn't need to be overdone because it's probably going to have your logo on your social media page anyway, near the post that they're seeing.
Yeah.
So less is more, but obviously we still want your posters to grab people's attention.
So it's really important to make sure that you're choosing the appropriate imagery. And by appropriate, we mean in style and content. So content-wise, if you're promoting an adult worship event, it's probably not a great idea to use photos of babies or children from the church. Hopefully that's not a huge shocker of a revelation. But in terms of style, if you're promoting a traditional carol service, you don't want to have kind of bright colours or childish fonts. Whereas if you were doing a new toddler group, those would absolutely be valid choices to brand and colour and content.
Yeah, it's about choosing the right style, the right look and feel for the thing that you're promoting.
Yeah, exactly. And image choice can be hard, and it's something that we will definitely come back to in the future. But a big thing with photography is to make sure it fits in. Often your posters will be better served by a single image as a background to the design, ensuring that the text is still easy to read, of course. This is opposed to sort of thumbnails of images being put around the text or sort of emojis and other little graphics that can often look like this sort of afterthought, and it starts to creep back towards a very cluttered layout. A really helpful test when designing is to walk across the room from your screen or even print out a draft and hang it on the wall. If you can't read it and get the point of the poster from the other side of the room, then your design really needs to be clearer. Think about sizing here too. For an inside pin board or notice board at your church, it's unlikely you'll go larger than A3, but actually people will have the time to stop and read and take in the information. But outside on a notice board or on the side of a building, you might be able to go significantly bigger, but this will have an impact on which images and graphics that you choose as well as fonts, especially if your poster is going to be in a location where people are passing by and need to be able to get the point of the event or thing that you're promoting really quickly.
Yeah, and while we're on printing, don't skimp on the quality. For large formats, you won't have a choice but to get your design professionally printed, unless you happen to just have an A1 printer sitting around at home. But for smaller ones, it can still often be a good idea. It doesn't mean spending the earth. There are some amazing online printers that offer real value, not you, Vistaprint, or even making friends with your local printer can be helpful. They can best advise or even offer support when things might go wrong with your designs. But the feel of your publicity in the hand shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah.
If you produced a beautiful flyer design, but it's printed on flimsy paper with the colours all muddied together and a white border around the edge because your printer can't do edge-to-edge printing, it can send a message that you don't care about quality. And that might sound really vain or pedantic, but it's about the feeling that people get from your publicity.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about some of the networking events where I spend my time, no one likes a cheap floppy business card because it makes you think the person who gave it to you works for a cheap floppy business, even if that's not actually the case at all. On the other hand, my small, quirky business cards get positive comments every time I hand one out because they're different and they're printed on good quality card. And then the final thing on printing, if your posters are outside, exposed to the elements, think about protecting them, either on a notice board with a cover or by printing on something like vinyl, which will last the wind and the rain. If the poster's only going to be outside for a week, you might get away with it, especially in the summertime. But if it's going to be out there for a while, then it's something to think about, or at least order a couple of spare copies.
Yeah, definitely. We've mostly covered print and tangible physical copies of posters and flyers and things, but I think it's also really important to think about how we will be using them online. Better the less cluttered a post with more details in the text, such as booking links or websites, with more details which you don't need to include in the graphics. We also need to think about possibly resizing it. So if your poster is A4 when you're printing off or of different flyer sizes, it actually might be better to resize to square, which is preferable for social media. But you could also think about reformatting it so you're creating a banner for your Facebook page that has the name of the event and the date, but isn't overcluttered so that when people go on your Facebook page, that's the first thing they see.
It grabs their attention, tells them what they need to know, and they can find out more.
Exactly. I mean, for a social media post, you don't need to have all of the information on the poster because the likelihood is you'll talk about them, and it gets people asking questions and creates that engagement. But please, 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 I beg you all, don't take a photo of a printed poster. You know, you've done a lovely poster, we've printed it off. Don't take a photo of it and use that photo as your online promotion, because I have seen that done several times, and it's really heartbreaking because the poster itself is quite nice, but the fact that it's a picture of the poster really feels like they're not valuing what they have created. And I think there are ways that you could do it. So, you know, fine. Actually, it's a great way if you're showing the delivery, putting a sort of quote like, yay, you know, we can't wait to share our Christmas flyers with everyone locally. We've just had them delivered, and sort of a big stack of them and maybe someone holding them. That's fine because that's sort of the event of the printed posters arriving, but just not as a standalone image. You know, I have seen it and it just breaks my heart because I think that it devalues what you've created.
It devalues it, and worst case, you can't actually read the content because it's blurry and at a lower quality than if they'd literally just gone file, save as a JPEG, and uploaded that to their social media directly.
Exactly. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned JPEG because actually we do need to think about how we are saving and sharing those images. So if you are a local church and you want to share it to either your association, your diocese, your local news outlet, or an organisation, and you want to say, look, we're having this event going on, please can you share it out? If you're sending stuff to people, share it in a JPEG or PNG if the purpose is to be shared online as a priority. They're standard formats for images to redistribute, just not PDF or something made in PowerPoint or Word, all of which I have received when being asked to share through the various platforms I manage, which is a pain for me as a social media manager because I have to take extra time faffing about to make sure it's in the right format for emails, social media, website, etc. You know, and it can just be really disheartening to people you work with if you're likely to be passing things on to them regularly. That's not to say you can't create them in Word document, but as you said already, Joe, just save as JPEG. Don't please send it to me as a Word document.
Yeah, and I think that's a typical example of these tips in that actually, will that take you extra time? Maybe it will take you 20 seconds to save it as a JPEG, but if you were going to have to take out your phone and take a picture of it or save it as a PDF anyway, then it's not taking you any extra time, but actually it's more efficient, you get better quality, it's a better way of working in general. And that's the heart of all of these tips, is that we know that pastors, vicars, ministers, your time is limited. This producing posters isn't going to be your priority for the week. So we want you to be able to use that time well and get the best result out of it.
Yeah.
And that leads on to our final point then. And it might sound like we say this every episode, and that's because we probably do, but prepare in advance.
Yeah.
Assuming that you've already got a comms plan, and hopefully you do after our last couple of episodes guiding you through how to create one, you should hopefully have an idea of what publicity needs producing and when. And this means you can be strategic about when you display or hand out your materials, for example, at the preceding event. But more than this, you can minimize the workload for yourself or your volunteers by having clear dates for the project to start and finish, and having all the information that's needed for the event included in a brief, so that it doesn't take lots of extra time asking questions and hunting these things down.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for listening to this episode. We'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback or areas you'd like us to explore further. You can email us at hello@gppodcast.uk. And if you're on social media, you can find us on our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/gppodcast.uk, or just search for Gourds and Pomegranates Podcast.
We will be back next week with a final episode of our first series. I'm very excited for it because it may or may not be slightly Christmas related, which does just fill me with joy. So if you're not already, please do subscribe to the podcast, and why not think about one person you could share it with this week to make their lives easier when it comes to church communications. We'll see you next week.